Good afternoon, and welcome to this new episode of Governance Dialogues. My name is Alissa Kole, and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center, and it is my pleasure to host you back on this program for what I hope will be a fascinating discussion on another governance topic. And for those of you who have joined us in our previous episodes, you would know that over the last 6 months or so, we have focused on particularly company-specific and country-specific topics. So with that, we've traveled from Germany to Saudi Arabia, back to the UK and other jurisdictions. And notably, we've explored over the last few months some of the most pressing and interesting corporate scandals, such as the Wirecard story and previously also the story of Yes Bank in India. And today, I would like to take a slightly different approach and focus on a topic which I believe to be of global importance, both for investors, corporate leaders, regulators, and other stakeholders, both in emerging and developed markets. And that is the issue of quality of disclosure and transparency, a topic that has received much interest and much discussion in the financial media and in other circles over the last 10 years. And yet, as we stand here today, we still don't have a single internationally recognized accounting standard. We arguably, and we'll talk about that in today's episode, still do not have a recognized framework of comparable ESG reporting. And we still don't necessarily have frameworks that are, again, internationally recognized for reporting of key assets, such as intangible assets, the importance of which has grown enormously over the last decade, in particular with the ascent of the tech companies whose asset is primarily intangible. So that is, I think, a critical topic to explore, and it's not only my opinion, but the numbers back up the story. So the spending on ESG data was approximately $200 million 5 years ago. Today is closer to $1 billion, $750 million to be precise. And clearly this is a topic of great interest for the investor community, in particular investors who are trying to increasingly compare data on issues such as, for example, corporate environmental footprint, another topic that has received increasing attention, in particular following the signature of the Paris Climate Accords. And with all these questions in mind, I couldn't think of a better invitee to today's episodes of Governance Dialogues than Robert Eccles, who is internationally recognized for his work on disclosure and transparency, notably his enormous contribution on integrating reporting standards worldwide. Robert, welcome to Governance Dialogues. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Lisa, nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us, and for what I hope will be a fascinating discussion. Many of you, of course, who are familiar with the corporate governance world are familiar also with Robert's enormous contribution to the field. But for those of you who are perhaps a little bit new, let me just say 2 words of introduction. Robert is the founding chairman of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and also one of the founders of IIRC, which is an integrated reporting standard. He's taught widely on various governance issues, in particular on disclosure. And leveraging his enormous experience, I would like to explore some of the pressing issues today in the world of accounting and disclosure. And with that, perhaps if I may start with the first kind of poignant question, combining the brave new world that we're living in today, COVID, with some of the work that you've been leading, and to ask you, how is the concept of sustainability and ESG reporting being shaped by events of 2020? What are the salient differences in terms of topics or the kinds of disclosures companies are making this year?
So again, thanks for the opportunity, Alissa. But before we start, let me just say that the timing of this is good. I'm in a very good mood. The election for president went the right way, thank God. In the United States, I wish the Democrats would have captured the Senate and kept more seats in the House, but I feel like this dark cloud is lifting above our heads, but not going away. We're going to be dealing with Trump and his fanatical family and minions for years to come. But let's be positive.
Let's.
right? Let's be positive. So to answer your question, this may surprise you a little bit. I think the most consequential thing from a reporting point of view that's happened this year was a document published in September by the IIRC Foundation, a consultation document for them to establish a sustainability standards board. So if you're not an accountant or you don't live in that community, this may sound a little wonky. Clearly issues like COVID have brought people's attention to social issues. I think that's good. Environmental issues have been on the table for a long time. But as you said in your introduction, there's really no generally accepted standards for ESG reporting like we have with financial reporting. And I think it's time to do that. And I think this consultation document that was released by the IIRC Foundation is an enormous step forward. And to be honest, surprising in some ways.
And so to the point of, again, looking at current developments, recent developments, how they've impacted the discussion on sustainability. One of the key developments we've seen this year, and one we discussed actually with Colin Mayer, whom we spoke about a few minutes ago, is this emergence of, or this wave of new legal provisions on the purpose of the corporation. So the countries like France changing their laws, allowing companies to essentially change their charters to create accountability to wider set of stakeholders. May I ask how you see that being reflected in corporate disclosure going forward, this reporting to a wider set of stakeholders story?
I mean, it's a good question. I think you may be a little bit ahead of your skis on this. So yes, there are laws that have been passed, like in France, and Danone has taken advantage of it. In the United States, we've had the Delaware Public Benefit Corporation for a while, and benefit corporations in other states. The fact of the matter is, you could probably count on one hand in this country the number of companies that have availed themselves of those legal structures. I think the same is true in France. You have a California company called Viva Systems, which has announced that it wants to convert to a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation. So I think as companies do that, then clearly there's a reporting requirement. They would benefit a lot by integrated reporting. They would benefit by standards for, ESG information. But to be honest, there really hasn't been much of a change. I mean, most companies are still the traditional C Corp, and there's talk about purpose. There's the Business Roundtable. I'm a little bit cynical about that, as some people probably know. So, there's rhetoric that's going in the right direction. But if you look at the quality of reporting, if you look at the conversions to these other legal structures, there's a long ways to go.
No, I do agree with you. And we actually had a conversation offline with Lucian Bebchuk, who's known for his skepticism about conversion to the purpose of the corporation, especially in the US, and his research looking at company practices following the Business Roundtable pledge. Actually, I do agree, leaves much to be desired. But let me ask you, you're currently working on something called Statement of Significant Audience and Materiality Campaign. So it's kind of a mouthful name, with the idea that by 2025, you'd like to see boards of directors produce such statements. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you have in mind, and why is that different from the efforts that you've seen undertaken before?
So let me go back in history a little bit. The Statement of Significant Audiences and Materiality is an idea I developed in my last book on integrated reporting. My co-author was Mike Cruz. I worked very closely with a gentleman and friend named Tim Yeomans, who's now with Federated Hermes EOS. And in the chapter on materiality, like what's material to report, financial, non-financial, we said, look, it really depends on how the board sees the purpose of the corporation. So we suggested this idea that the board publish a 1 or 2 page statement of significant audiences and materiality. Technically correct, not euphonious. Since then, we've rebranded the idea to be statement of purpose. And the campaign is that every listed company publish a statement of purpose by 2025. So then the obvious question is, where are we? And the answer is, we're not very far. And that's interesting. The Business Roundtable, I think there's some 200 companies. They came out with much fanfare in August of 2019 with their statement of the purpose of a corporation. I thought, okay, we've all agreed on a kind of multi-stakeholder capitalism. So it should be easy to get these companies to publish company-specific by their board of directors, signed by their board of directors. It hasn't happened. I can give you two examples. One is a Swedish company. It's a private equity firm called EQT. It's based in Stockholm. It's listed on NASDAQ. And in their 2019 annual report, they published a very nice statement of purpose. And, private equity is a somewhat controversial industry in various ways, but they're very clear. EQT is my gold standard when it comes to ESG and impact throughout their entire portfolio, as opposed to kind of a segregated impact fund. Another company that has published a statement of purpose, and in full disclosure, they're a client of mine, which may shock your audience, is Philip Morris International. It's a tobacco company. Yes, they sell cigarettes. They are listed in the United States. It's a US company, but the reason I'm working with them is that they have made a public commitment to a smoke-free future. And they are actively cannibalizing their cigarette business with reduced risk products. I'm not going to get into the details, but very significantly in their 2020 proxy statement. And for those of you that know the United States, the proxy statement is about as official a filing document as you can get, along with the 10K. They've got a statement of purpose signed by every single member of their board of directors, making a public commitment to their purpose, explaining what this means to stakeholders, including shareholders. They followed it up a few months later with an excellent integrated report that gives targets to 2025. For example, they say that by 2025, 38 to 42% of their revenues will come from reduced risk products. So I'm thinking, gee, if a US tobacco company can publish a statement of purpose in its 2020 proxy statement, followed with an integrated report, all these excuses that I get from companies in the United States around securities law and fiduciary duty,
Yes,
we can't do a statement of purpose, we can't do an integrated report, it has no credibility with me. And so, I'm engaged with Tim and colleagues at Said and others on a campaign. And I think what we need to do is to get...
you're in demand.
What we need to do is to get enough companies in different industries in different countries to publish a statement of purpose, and then it really becomes kind of best practice, show that it can be done, nobody died, and we're still hopeful that we can achieve our objective of, every listed company by 2025.
Interesting. And it also makes me think with your example of Philip Morris, which is a very interesting one, because in a lot of the portfolios of large institutional funds, investors, they've actually made a statement that they will basically disengage or divest from specific industries like coal, like tobacco, and others. And your example, in some ways, kind of goes perhaps to the contrary of that movement, if I understand correctly. So you can have in the world that you're working with a company that is perhaps in a controversial industry, but is taking a positive effort towards their sustainability plans and commitments.
I mean, Alissa, you raise an important question from the investor perspective, which is kind of divestment or exclusion versus engagement.
Exactly.
And let's be honest. I mean, the negative externalities of the tobacco industry are well known. But every industry produces negative externalities. Oil and gas companies do, food companies do, sugar, water, obesity. And so the question then becomes, what is the role of the investment community in facilitating the changes that are necessary in the business models of companies in all these industries if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? Tobacco is, highly emotional, very controversial. I get it. They've got a bad reputation. They earned it over decades. If people want to exclude tobacco stocks for, values-based reasons, they should. I mean, that's perfectly legitimate. It's their money. They can make a decision. What is missing for me in the exclusion debate in tobacco, it's a small industry, it's not a lot of market cap, it's easy to exclude, is what is the theory of change? Exclusion alone is not going to make the tobacco companies go away. It's not going to stop 1 billion people smoking cigarettes. Exclusion alone is not going to facilitate a transition for oil and gas companies to become energy companies. And so I think it's fair to question the purpose of a company, to want to know if they are trying to, transform in a major way their business model, like I think PMI is, like BP is talking about, like Equinor is doing. but then they need to make it clear their board supports it. They need to report on their progress through integrated reporting. And again, the quality of integrated reporting is pretty sketchy in most countries. It's horrible in the United States. And it would be greatly improved if we had standards for ESG information. And that's why I think this consultation document from the IFRS Foundation, the people that oversee international financial reporting standards, the rest of the world does that. Typical US exceptionalism, we have US GAAP here.
Of course.
The fact that this organization would come out suggesting that it establish a sustainability standards board so that we can have global standards for ESG information, just as we do for financial information, could be an absolute game changer for companies, for the investment community, and for the world.
No, I do agree with you on that. It's also interesting to, one of the topics that sort of comes out of what you just said is sectoral approaches and whether we actually are served as ultimate beneficiaries by exclusion. And we indeed hosted Craig Lazara, who's the head of index strategy at S&P, in one of our previous dialogues to discuss passive investment and some of the issues you referred to in just a minute ago. But in this conversation on convergence, because ultimately what you're in your work you're trying to reach, as I understand, is convergence in environmental ESG reporting standards to achieve comparability. And my question to you is, to what extent do you think that perhaps sectoral approaches or or understanding or some exceptions or specific standards for sectors, be they airlines or food sector or tobacco or whatnot, are needed within that broader approach? Are we being well served by a single framework, or is there a need for greater nuances?
I mean, you raise a fundamental question. You mentioned at the beginning that I was the founding chairman of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. As you know, that's the approach that SASB is taking. They've created a classification system of 11 sectors, 77 industries, and through their industry working groups that involve companies, investors, industry experts, they've identified the material issues, the things that matter to enterprise value creation over the long term, and suggested KPIs for how to report on them. And when you look at it, it's very interesting. It's a relatively small number of material issues. It averages about 5 or 6, something like that. So really quite doable. SASB is very complementary to the Global Reporting Initiative, which I know people are also familiar with, founded by friends of mine. They had a very different mission. Their mission was to provide information to civil society on the positive and negative externalities being created by companies. And so there's 2 different definitions of materiality, and I don't want to get in the weeds on this too much, but there's the definition that is used by the IFRS, used by US GAAP, financial reporting. Materiality is what matters to investors. That's what SASB uses. GRI's definition is what matters to the world. So I think that the solution that we'll find, and with some colleagues, I'm writing a reply to the IFRS consultation, is that there will be industry-specific metrics that matter to investors, that you will have another body like Global Reporting Initiative, which is identifying issues that are not material to investors today, could become so tomorrow. Climate change would be an example. I think income inequality is in the process of becoming an example. They're like the canaries in the coal mine, and through the notion of dynamic materiality, things change. Social expectations change, the world changes, and what was originally not material to investors can become so. And so what you've got is a group called the Impact Management Project, led by a good friend of mine, brilliant woman named Clara Barbie. And what she has done is bring together in a structured network a number of organizations that are working on standards for ESG. And importantly, a month or so ago, a very significant paper was published by them called Statement of Intent to Work Together Towards Comprehensive Corporate Reporting. And it was GRI and SASB, along with CDP and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and the International Integrated Reporting Council, which you mentioned I was also a founder of. And so having these 5 NGOs, these 5 different acronyms in the alphabet soup out there, come together and publish a paper presenting a common point of view and way forward is another enormous step. And I see that what they've done is lay the foundation that the IFRS Foundation can build on. And what they bring is really the credibility of the state. You've got the EU taxonomy, the non-financial reporting directive. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds, but Alissa, I've been studying this problem of reporting and standards for ESG information for over 30 years. And I've felt like, Don Quixote or Sisyphus, you pick your metaphor. This is the closest I've seen where we can get to the point where we have true global standards of the same degree of reliability and rigor as we do for financial reporting. And the world needs it, and it needs it soon.
It's great to hear this optimistic note coming from you, and actually it sort of alludes to my next question, which is kind of a more global temperature taking, because you did allude on a number of occasions to developments in the US and how difficult it's been, and how much hope there was after the Business Roundtable pledge, and some of the disappointment that we've seen after. Do you think that these developments, the ones you just alluded to now, are sort of closing the gap as far as kind of developed and emerging markets go? Or is everyone looking in the same direction now? Of course, we know that the European Commission is highly active in regulatory standard setting in this area. But is, the Africas, the Asias, the Latin Americas, or countries of regulators looking in the same direction and sort of playing according to the same songbook?
I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, I'm not an expert on what's going on in emerging markets. What I can tell you is that the accounting standards from the IFRS Foundation are used by 140 countries around the world. So that would pick up most of the emerging markets, certainly any ones that have any significant capital markets. So I don't think it's so much an emerging market, developed market distinction that needs to be drawn. It's more a US compared to the rest of the world distinction. I mean, the US is slower to getting on board in the corporate community around purpose. It's slower to get on board in terms of the investment community, although that's changing. The very large asset managers are all based in the US, and they get it. I mean, I think 9 of the top 10. So what I see happen, and the SEC, I mean, particularly in this current administration, which, thankfully is ending soon, there's been a little bit of talk about human capital. That's good. And there was some guidance around, more fulsome reporting in COVID-19. But you're not going to see anything happen in the US like you see with the EU taxonomy. And I don't expect it to. And why I'm encouraged about the IFRS Foundation establishing a Sustainability Standards Board is that essentially that will enable US companies to use those same standards. There's nothing that would preclude them from doing so, as can companies located in any country in the world. The issue is probably more company size than where you're based. And so I think it's a fair question to say, can the mid-cap companies, can the smaller companies, do they have the resources to report on sustainability information? But as I said, if we're going down an industry-specific route, and that's what's at the heart of interest for the investment community, it's only 5 or 6. And companies should have that information themselves for their own good, because there's a lot of studies that have been done. I've done some. George Serafim has done a lot more that show there's a very clear relationship between sustainability performance and financial performance. It plays out over time, but it's clearly there.
True. Some of these studies we will disseminate following this episode. But in conclusion, I would like to perhaps, we still have a few minutes, ask 2 questions. And one is sort of moving away from the mainstream of financial reporting and standards, are a little bit as to the means. How are companies actually getting their point across today? And the role of social media. So, we went from this kind of thin annual report to a very thick annual report. And now there's conversations, and we've had a couple around how boards and corporations should be actually communicating to this wider stakeholder community. Should social media or other electronic means of communication be more actively used? And we've had some good and not so good examples, with the Elon Musk Tesla's case, where he was pursued by SEC for making some remarks as to that SEC judged would impact the share price of Tesla. What is your feeling on the means side? What's the way forward, if I may ask?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to have to end this conversation on a low note for you. I mean, I have no idea about social media. I mean, I'm turning 70 next year. I try and pay attention to it. It doesn't excite me. So I think technology is important.
Hmm.
I think that companies should do a much better job of using their websites for integrated reporting. So it's not just this kind of concrete PDF document. BASF does a wonderful job. SAP does a wonderful job. Um, there's interactive, features to it. You can understand how they see the relationships between financial and non-financial performance variables. And so I think leveraging the internet for reporting and doing it on an ongoing basis if the data change, I think that's a very useful thing to do as opposed to a once a year annual report. Where social media comes into this, to be honest, I'm kind of skeptical. I think social media clearly has a role that it plays with, consumers and with kind of the general public. But the people that are holding the shares in companies, the people that I want to push companies to have transition business models, the big asset owners, the big asset managers, they may be leveraging social media by buying AI big data products from, different vendors that exist out there that they incorporate into their decision-making process, a lot of other information. But, they're not going on social media to decide whether they should buy or sell a stock or to affect their investment strategy. So, Lisa, if you want to know about social media, I'm afraid you're going to have to do an interview with someone other than me.
We did a few on tech governance, so we're continuing, and on also we'll be doing a few on engagements ourselves on social media, but perhaps for another discussion. In closing, sort of this quite interesting conversation, I'd just like to ask kind of one question on your beliefs, and then of course going back to this whole the broader debate, not stepping away from disclosure, but sort of the ESG debate, and there's a range of disagreements on this front with the likes of Colin Mayer, who thinks that the stakeholder, who's a true believer in the stakeholder model and the fact that ESG is consistent with corporate value maximization, and the likes of, for example, Robert Armstrong, who wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago in the FT where he said, and I quote, I think something that doing well by doing good is overselling reality. Where do you, in a few words, position yourself in that spectrum of opinions?
So let me say that my colleague Colin Mayer is one of my heroes. He wrote a brilliant little piece that was published in Fortune on the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's letter to the New York Times with Leo Strine, who's the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, and a Dutch legal scholar named Jaap Winter. And they made a very compelling case for the public benefit corporation. So to cut to the chase, I don't think that the corporate form we have today is fit for purpose. It maybe was good enough for a period of time. I think, we need to have massive conversion to a new legal form, as we were talking about earlier, supplemented by having, regulatorily required standards for ESG information that, mandated, reported on, that are auditable, just like the financial statements. And so this incrementalism of, voluntary sustainability disclosure, statements of purpose from, traditional C corporations, in the world we have today to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we're not going to get there. So I think we need to get back to the basics of really how we're defining what capitalism is. And I think that starts with corporate form. And that changes fiduciary duty. And I think we need to have that same conversation with fiduciary duty on the investor side, looking at things at the system level.
Yeah, I think that's perhaps the best way to end this half an hour conversation on your beliefs and what you think the shortcomings of the current model are. And we'll be continuing this conversation, particularly on ESG and the various components of it, in future episodes of Governance Dialogues. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I would very much like to thank you for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. And of course, to recommend the viewers to look at your, if I'm not mistaken, the last book on integrating reporting movement, but also the various articles that you've been publishing recently. And some of our work on this topic is available, as you may know, widely from our website. So thank you, Robert, for your time and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Nice chatting with you. Have a good week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.